Hello and welcome to another edition of As the Blade Turns. My name is Dave Leese, and for those of you who are new here, please subscribe below and remember to smash that like button because this video is likely going to be slightly controversial. I have not fully taken the last week off from my duties as hostess of As the Blade Turns. I have been doing quite a bit of reading and studying for this next edition. I have spent time thinking about what exactly I wanted to discuss, and as the world moves along, I think there will be many aspects of this story for us to discuss as we continue to experience the fallout of the 2022 Olympic Games in Beijing and the situation with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I would like to start by giving an update about the latest with Kamila Valieva and her Russian Olympic Committee teammates. Russia's official state news agency, TASS, reported that Kamila Valieva and her Russian Olympic Committee figure skating teammates Alexander Galyamov, Mark Kondratyuk, Anastasia Mishina, Victoria Sinitsina, and Anna Sherbakova were awarded the Order of Friendship, while Nikita Katsalapov received the Order of Honor, and Alexandra Trusova received the First Class Order of Merit for the Fatherland. So these are state awards that are presented by Vladimir Putin and are given for contributions to the state. Now, this is very interesting because it is unclear what exactly is received other than the actual ribbons, which and the adornments to them, which you can find on the internet. It's unclear exactly what else comes along with these awards. So I reached out to athletes who have actually received the Order of Friendship. And it's interesting, this is a state award, and obviously there is a tremendous amount of prestige and honor from the country that bestows this award, which was originated in the Soviet Union, and now has the Order of Friendship is the Russian version of this. In addition to these awards, there is a monetary award that is given to these athletes. They will receive a much larger pension. There are also apartments and cars that are presented to these athletes for their contributions to the state in many cases. It's interesting to note that Kamila Valieva did get the Order of Friendship. It had been suspected that she might have received the Order of Honor, which Nikita Katsalapov actually earned. Now, the Order of Honor is one level higher than the Order of Friendship. Now, he was also a gold medalist at the 2014 Olympic Games in Sochi, so perhaps that contributed to how he earned the Order of Honor as opposed to the Order of Friendship. Now, Kamila Valieva and Anna Sherbakova did earn the Order of Friendship. Alexandra Trusova did not, and she was awarded the Merit of the Fatherland of the First Class, which is a rank below the Order of Friendship. Now, it's very interesting as she did land 5 quadruple jumps and make history at the 2022 Olympic Games. We have to remember that 4 years ago, Alena Zagitova and Evgenia Medvedeva, the silver medalist in 2018, did receive the Order of Friendship. And one has to wonder if Sasha Trusova's outburst after the free program had something to do with why she didn't earn that distinction from the government. Now, these awards do have to do with how the athlete performed at the Olympic Games in question. It's interesting to note that other competitions don't seem to matter as much. Dina Averna, the Russian rhythmic gymnast, did earn the Order of Friendship, even though she didn't earn the gold medal at the 2021 Olympic Games in Tokyo, or 2020, as it officially was known, but held in 2021. But her twin sister, Irina Averna, only got Merit of the Fatherland of the second class. Arisha finished in 4th place. Now, the twins had finished 1st and 2nd at so many world championships, European championships, and World Cups over the many years. And it just seems very interesting that it was not fully taken into question. Dina one-upping Arisha even in retirement in terms of the pension. So just an interesting note for that situation. There's also been speculation that Sasha Trusova may or may not still be training, and her participation at the upcoming First Channel Made-for-TV Challenge Cup is in question. Kamila Valieva and Anna Shcherbakova have both been seen training, and it is also suspected that Sasha Trusova may wish to switch coaches. She was seen yelling at Gorshkov after the free program. Remember, she had said that she hated everyone. It's suspected that she wants to train with Alexei Mishin or perhaps return to the Angels of Plushenka. It is very interesting to note that Evgenia Tarasova and Vladimir Morozov didn't earn any distinction from the government for their performances. Being left out of the team event certainly had consequences for them, certainly monetarily in their future. Now, that's not to say that they left empty-handed, because the government has decided to reward Russian athletes based on their performance at the Olympic Games, which is customary in Russia and in the United States and in many other countries around the world. The Russian will be getting 4 million rubles for a gold medal, 2.5 million for a silver medal, and 1.7 million rubles for a bronze medal. If you exchange that into dollars, 4 million rubles is roughly a little bit more than $53,000. Now, the United States actually awards less prize money. Forbes magazine found that Americans get approximately $37,000 for a gold medal, $22,500 for silver, and $15,000 for bronze. Now, that's a little bit different in the United States as opposed to Russia, because Russia also gives state bonuses, which could be either state or regional. They could also get bonuses from the Figure Skating Federation, as well from their sports school. So someone like Anna Shcherbakova could be getting money from the government, from Moscow, from the Russian Figure Skating Federation potentially, as well as from Sambo 70. So it is certainly not a bad position to be in, to be a medalist at these games. Medalists also automatically get a higher pension from the government. It's called a presidential scholarship, and that's so that athletes aren't selling off their medals in advanced age, like we have seen Olga Korbut do, eBaying some of her medals over the years to make money. It's actually not a tremendous amount of money. It's approximately $634 that they do earn from the government for life. Now, if you have been watching the news or reading the news over the last week, you've certainly been aware of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And one of the reasons it's relevant is when we talk about state-sponsored doping and we talk about how important sports are in the Russian Federation and how important they are to President Vladimir Putin, it's always important to follow the money. So I wanted to discuss some of the key figures that are involved in Russian Olympic sports and Russian Olympic business, just to discuss some of the ties, and you could see the trickle of money and influence that many of these sports and individuals actually have. So I wanted to start with Alisher Usmanov. He is a Russian business magnate. He is also the husband of rhythmic gymnastics queen Irina Wiener. Now, Alisher Usmanov earned a fortune that's estimated of up to $20 billion in metal, mining, and other businesses. Now, one of the reasons that Russia is invading Ukraine, other than what you would hear if you watch the speech by Vladimir Putin, is that Ukraine has tremendous resources. There are tremendous metal and oil to be mined there, both of which have been businesses that Alisher Usmanov has made a great fortune of. He holds shares in many tech companies, which also were sanctioned by President Biden. Now, he is the president of the International Fencing Organization, which is interesting because his wife, Irina Wiener, runs Russian rhythmic gymnastics, and she's also the vice president of the technical committee for the Federation of International Gymnastics for Rhythmic Gymnastics. So they have, that couple has ties into two Olympic sports, both of which are closely tied to the Ministry of Sport in Russia. Now, When we talk about Alisher Usmanov, it's important to remember that he managed the company Gazprom until 2014. Now, that is Russia's state-owned gas company. Russia's state-owned gas company, Gazprom, built Nord 2, which was recently sanctioned by Germany over the invasion. Now, very interesting here, if you remember, because Gazprom is believed to be funding much of Putin's invasion into Ukraine. They're also the sponsor of Team Tutberidze. If you watched the 2021 Russian figure skating championships, you'll remember the big G on the side of eteri Tutberidze's mask, as they were newly the sponsor of Team Tutberidze. Now, Rostelecom, the Russian communications company, was also sanctioned by President Biden this week. They are the sponsor of the Russian Figure Skating Grand Prix, formerly known as the Cup of Russia for many years. They have since been the title sponsor for at least a decade. So that is another business tied to figure skating sanctioned by the government. Now, we have to look at Sberbank and VTB. Sberbank sponsors Anna Sherbakova. There were some who believed that Anna Sherbakova's sponsorship with Sberbank perhaps influenced the decision of the Russian Federation to promote her over Elizaveta Tuktamisheva. We'll never know that for sure, but it is interesting that Anna Sherbakova did have commercials on Instagram and other social media for Sberbank, which was one of the two largest financial institutions in Russia, sanctioned by President Biden this week, as well as VTB, which was a longtime sponsor of Russian gymnastics. Alisher Usmanov was also believed to have had major shares in VTB. So if you were watching the news and hearing those names and remembering just some of the ties that we think about in terms of dollars. Now, also, it's important to remember that Alena Zagitova stars in shows, skating shows that are owned and run by Tatiana Navka. Now, Tatiana Navka is a Olympic ice dance champion. Now, Tatiana Navka was actually born in Ukraine. However, she is the wife of Dmitry Peskov. Dmitry Peskov, you'll see that name pop up in the news as he is Putin's press attaché and his spokesperson. So very interesting that Tatiana Navka, who is Ukrainian, married to the press spokesperson who is discussing many of Putin's advancements for the current war. Alena Zagitova and Tatiana Navka recently put on performances in Dubai, which were part of a money scandal, as it was believed that there was perhaps potential money laundering going on. This is something that was investigated, in air quotes. Nothing wound up coming of it from wire transfers that happened from this performance in Dubai. Alena Zagitova was also named after Alena Kabayeva. She is the purported mistress and baby mama of President Vladimir Putin. Now, one of the more bizarre ties between Russian sport and the government was how several famous Russian athletes and Olympians were elected to the Russian Duma, which is the equivalent of the Russian Parliament or Senate. Those members include Svetlana Khorkina, Anton Sikorolidze, Irina Rodnina, and Alena Kabayeva. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Russian doping history in some of our favorite Olympic sports. In 2001, Alena Kabayeva and her teammate Irina Shashina were disqualified from their results at the 2001 World Championships and the 2001 Goodwill Games because they both tested positive for furosemide, which is a banned diuretic. Now, at that time, it was just believed that this was for weight loss. But it's very interesting as the diuretic furosemide is also believed to be used by athletes who are using performance-enhancing drugs, as it helps flush the system, which helps eliminate the remnants of those drugs. So athletes who are using a meldonium or a TMZ would perhaps take furosemide to help flush it from the system. Now, in rhythmic gymnastics, we do know that weight is the utmost importance. So at the time, there wasn't much that we thought of besides the fact that they had taken furosemide and perhaps it was for weight loss. But that was not the reason that Irina Wiener gave. Now, remember, she does have ties to both Russian rhythmic gymnastics and the Federation of International Gymnastics. Now, perhaps did the fact that Arena Wiener has ties to both organizations, influenced the fact that they did not receive a lengthy suspension for taking furosemide. We won't know. At the time, it wasn't believed that furosemide was such an awful drug. This was still relatively early on in the world anti-doping movement. If you think about the fact that in 2000, both Alena Berezhnaya and gymnast Andrea Radikon had been stripped of titles. Alena Berezhnaya stripped of the 2000 European title, and Andrea Radikon stripped of her Olympic all-around title for taking Sudafed. Now, the Romanian Olympic doctor actually has spoken about giving Sudafed to other athletes when they weren't feeling well. It did impact that in those cases, although Sudafed is certainly not believed to be nearly as potent as something like furosemide. Now, it's very ironic that Alena Kabayeva and Irina Chachina were able to return to competition, because in 2021, Rusada banned Maria Sotskova, Russian figure skater, because she had tested positive in 2020 for furosemide, the same drug. So 20 years later, something that just stripped two rhythmic gymnasts of two titles, and they were able to compete in 2003 and 2004. Alena Kabayeva winning both of those competitions. Very interesting that Rusada banned Maria Sotskova for 10 years for furosemide, almost making her some sort of a pariah. But if you read Grigory Rodchenkov's book, or the book The Russian Affair, which was written by the initial whistleblowers who actually outed Grigory Rodchenkov for his participation in the state-sponsored doping program, both books talk about Rusada designating certain athletes as scapegoats for lengthy bans, and certain high-level athletes being protected. Protected athletes would never be drug tested at certain events. Now, this is really interesting, because if you start to wonder, why is Maria Sotskova, of all people, banned for 10 years for participation, and it was a really harsh penalty and wording, the way it was written. But you have to remember about protected athletes and what it could potentially mean. Because this is something that has been pushed through. The runner, who is the original whistleblower, Yulia Stepanova, talked about becoming a protected athlete. And as a protected athlete, she would have been able to run while using performance-enhancing drugs, or run dirty, at the Russian trials for a World Championships, for European Championships, or an Olympic Games. In that case, she argues that the Russian Track Federation wanted the top protected athletes to run dirty so that they would be the top finishers at those trials, and then able to represent Russia at an Olympic Games, a World Championships, or a European Championships. Also interesting that the athletes, she argues, would be tested prior to leaving for the event, so that they would know that they wouldn't test positive at the competitions. It's very interesting when they talk about the washout periods. We've heard about the washout period for TMZ, why potentially there was only a trace amount in Kamila Valieva's sample. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about protected athletes, because it's very important when we talk about the ISU, because the ISU has actually had changes to their anti-doping laws or rules that have changed over the last several seasons. And it's interesting is that certain countries are following the new rules and certain countries are following the old rules. One of the interesting aspects to all of this is the ISU rule change for doping. Now, for many years, at an ISU championship, such as a World Championships or Four Continents or European Championships, the top three athletes plus one random athlete would always get tested. If you recall, Paulina Edmonds told us for years that she was always the athlete, in her opinion, who was selected for doping because she had the hardest technical content. Now, in 2021, this was actually changed. Now, also, just remember that at the ISU Championships, it's top three plus one. At a Grand Prix event, it was always the winner plus one random. Well, it actually changed for the 2021 year by the ISU. So this is very interesting, because it was then that the organization who is running the event, so if it's Skate America, USADA does the drug testing on behalf of the organizations. If it's at Skate Canada, the Canadian doping enforcement agency would do the testing. At the Rostelecom, it would be RUSADA that would do the testing. Very interesting because those organizations get to pick a certain number for testing. So this is an actual rule that had changed, and there's only a certain number of quota. Now, if you think about it, it's very interesting because we can see from Kamila Valieva's report by the Court of Arbitration for Sport that she was drug tested at the European Championships, she was drug tested at Russian Nationals, and she was drug tested at Skate Canada. And you could see those by the dates of the tests. She was not tested at the Rostelecom Cup. Now, we have to think about this critically because in speed skating, if an athlete breaks a world record, they are required to be tested. Now remember, the International Skating Union governs both speed skating and figure skating. And somehow the ISU Congress didn't determine that a figure skater who breaks a Grand Prix has to be tested. Well, guess who broke 3 world records at the Rostelecom Cup just a few months ago? Kamila Valieva, and she wasn't selected for drug testing by RUSADA, and it makes you wonder about protected athletes. Also important to note about that, when you think about the washout period of trimetazidine, which is somewhere between roughly 7 to 9 days, as we're learning about, because this season, the Grand Prix was canceled due to COVID. Now, the Grand Prix, and remember, Russian Nationals. Remember, Yulia Stepanova talked about Russian Nationals being an event where certain athletes who were protected of a certain status would never be tested. Now, let's think about it. If an athlete was taking a drug like TMZ that had a washout period of 7 to 9 days, it's possible that they could have used the drug TMZ all the way after Skate Canada through the Russian Nationals, thinking that they wouldn't be tested, and then to wash out when they were in Krasnoyarsk, potentially, prior to going to the Olympic Games. And that is how an athlete would take a drug like TMZ for several months, be able to build up the excess number of training. Remember, we heard about the aberrant number of run-throughs that these Russian athletes were doing in Krasnoyarsk, would then wash out prior to flying for Beijing, test clean at the team competition, but still have a positive test result. And remember, RUSADA did not mark that sample as a priority to be tested, as the athletes going to the Olympics were supposed to be marked as a priority urine sample if they were going to Stockholm to be tested, because even though Russia can collect the sample, their doping lab in Moscow is not actually accredited. Now, RUSADA is somehow still accredited. And one of the interesting things that Loop Lift Lunge discovered on Twitter is that RUSADA actually had to have a new director general installed shortly before the Russian Figure Skating Championships. Now, the interesting note there is that WADA had to approve the new director general of RUSADA. So is it perhaps that this director general, who is WADA approved, was perhaps more stringent and taking fewer risks? Is that how an athlete who perhaps would have been protected before would have actually been tested? Because why wasn't Kamila Valieva a protected athlete if she was protected at Rostelecom and not chosen for doping? Now, this is if, of course, you believe the numerous reports that have come out based on Dick Pound's work and in large part to the confessions of Yulia Stepanova and her husband, Valery Stepanov. Now, very interesting to talk about as Dr. Zhivetsky. Now, we need to talk about him because Dr. Zhivetsky, remember, is responsible for 7 rowers being banned. Now, if you are a figure skating federation, why would you hire a doctor who had admittedly given performance-enhancing drugs to athletes and ruined their careers? And yet this is someone who has been so prevalent in Russian figure skating to the point that he was in the Russian team box at the Olympics doing the wave, leading the cheers with them. And he has been so omnipresent at figure skating competitions, often standing behind the coaches of Team Tutberidze and in the shadows. He was also the medical director of the Rustellecom Cup when he was not seen wearing his face mask during COVID, during times when athletes are supposed to be so COVID cautious during a global pandemic. His mask was often below his face. Just another character reference for an anesthesiologist who is the team doctor for an event where you'd perhaps expect an orthopedist. Now, he is believed to have ties to Nina Mosier, to eteri tutberidze, and to Alexander Julin. Now, it's very interesting because in 2016, he gave the drug meldonium to Ekaterina Bobrova at the 2016 European Championships. It is believed that meldonium is injected, even though you can take it in a pill form, and Grigory Rodchenkov talks in his book about why you wouldn't give a pill. Now, eteri tutberidze, when you remember, she gave an interview about meldonium and how athletes need their supplements, they need their vitamins, and that they would have to use something else after meldonium was banned. It's believed that she used words that indicated that meldonium was actually taken as an injection. So very interesting there, as it's illegal to actually inject certain drugs. Now, one of my coaches actually knows Dr. Zhivetsky well. He met him at the wedding of Tatiana Voloshajar and Maxim Trankov, two students of Nina Mosier. Very interesting there. Now, about Zhivetsky, he had applied for a patent for xenon gas to be used as a performance-enhancing drug, and it acts like EPO. So how is this doctor who's applying for patents for xenon gas, how is someone as smart as eteri tutberidze keeping on employing someone who has been a part of this when she is supposed to be protecting her athletes? It makes you wonder about state-sponsored doping and whether or not its tentacles actually go into Russian figure skating and these tests. Now, very interesting is that Sasha Julin actually recently spoke to the press, and he said that when they reported about a positive doping test in the Russian team and they didn't give a name, every coach was worried about if it was their athlete. He said that on Match TV. Now, let's think about this critically for a moment. In America, the system is not as strong. We know that Raphael Artunian, who has coached athletes in both Russia and the United States, gave an interview. Remember when he said, an athlete was dying and she is alive, when he talked about that athlete taking heart medication. Now let's talk about how they knew for several days that an athlete had tested positive, but the name had not been revealed. It is believed that the name was actually known within the Russian Figure Skating Federation, but Sasha Julin is saying they didn't know who it was. Okay, so let's talk about this. Raphael talked about how in Russia, it is the system. It is the system that makes the skater. It is not the individual who makes their own career. He was talking a little bit about Nathan Chen and how Nathan Chen and his mother, had gone against his wishes for his program content, but that Nathan's mother was really responsible for developing him as an athlete, and that Raphael was just an employee. Instead, they talk about the system, and they talk about how athletes are given drugs or supplements. So let's think about it. If you choose to believe that Kamila Valieva did drink in a glass that her grandfather must have burped in, and that is how she ingested TMZ and perhaps two other drugs that were also found in her system, L-carnitine and hypoxin, is that how she got it? Or why is Sasha Julin admitting that every coach was afraid that it would be their athlete? It just makes you wonder. Now remember, Sasha Julin's athlete, Ekaterina Bobrova, was the athlete who got banned for meldonium in 2016. So he has had an athlete test positive, and yet he still continues to use the same doctor, Dr. Zhivetsky. So you keep having to wonder about why a coach like Sasha Julin would continue to use an athlete who already screwed his other athlete in 2016, unless this is all controlled from much higher up. And it is amazing how these same coaches pretend to not know anything and know everything at the same time, which is one of their favorite tactics when talking to Western journalists. They like to admit or purport that Westerners are not as smart as they are, But they continue to talk about doping and to drop hints. And it's very interesting how they just can't seem to stop talking about it. Now, I did want to talk a little bit about meldonium, as it does have similar properties to TMZ, which both involve blood oxygen. Now, this is interesting because we have to remember that WADA primarily tests urine in figure skating. And if you look at the WADA test results for year to year, the majority of tests done in figure skating are done as urine samples. There were only 2 blood samples that were actually done. Now, this is perhaps something that I believe is really outdated. Now, urine samples primarily test for steroids, which are not really used in figure skating. This is how you'll often hear the argument, it's not good to take figures, for a figure skater to take steroids, they become too big. But as we see, a drug like trimetazidine is something that would help the heart. It's very similar to meldonium, right? So those drugs would really be more tested and more useful under blood testing. That's how they often discover EPO. They test for certain levels that are found in the blood. Now, in cycling and in other sports, soccer, track and field, they're using something that's known as the biological passport. And that's a computerized system that takes the levels of a urine test and a blood test, and it establishes acceptable corridors for athletes over time, because they are comparing their levels from urine testing and from blood testing over time. Now, theoretically, it can actually also save lives for athletes that are doing doping, as there have been athletes who are doping more on their own, who take these drugs and actually, have died from doping. Now, it would certainly indicate, aberrations. Now, I also wanted to talk about the journalist Halos Zebelt from Germany. He is a co-author of an article about Kamila Valieva, and he actually argues in this article, he talked to a renowned doping expert, Mario Thevis, who believes that a hair analysis could decisively advance Kamila Valieva's case. Now, it's unlikely, sure, that lawyers would allow further testing to be done on an athlete aside from the B sample. Now, remember, an A sample and a B sample are taken at the same time. An athlete gives one urine sample and it's put into 2 different bottles. So how would the B sample be different than the A sample unless something was contaminated? If they should be the same P sample. But of course, stranger things have happened. Remember, Marina Klimova once tested positive for drugs back in 1991, and her B sample was magically clean. Marina Klimova was then cleared to compete. This is perhaps indication of either a strange coincidence or corruption, depending on which you believe. But these types of things have been known to happen in the world anti-doping movement. So that B sample of Kamila Valieva is certainly going to be of interest. Now, Mario Thevis, head of the renowned Cologne Doping Control Laboratory, suggests that taking a hair sample from the figure skater, in the case of Russian Kamila Valieva, with the analysis, one can possibly distinguish very well whether it was a matter of repeated intake of trimetazidine in larger quantities or an accidental single dose, said doping expert Thevis in the ARD interview. According to media reports, Valieva and her lawyers stated in the hearing before the International Court of Arbitration for Sport, CAS, that the drug trimetazidine, which is banned in trading in competitions, had accidentally entered her body through the contamination of a drink with her grandfather's heart medication. Decomposition products of substances can be detected in hair for a long time, so it would give almost a history of how often TMZ would have been taken. Now, hypoxin has been used in Russian competitive sports for a long time. In addition, another substance apparently found on 15-year-old Valieva comes into focus, hypoxin. According to ARD information, the heart drug has been used in Russian competitive sports for a long time. The reason for this is also a Russian study from 2003, which is available to ARD. It says, under competition conditions, the results achieved improved by 2 to 6% through the administration of the agent. Hypoxin is not on the doping list, but is against, in the background of this study, the award Valieva could indicate an intention of the Russian camp. In some sports, a difference in performance of 2 to 6% is decisive for whether you are among winners or losers, said Thevis. According to the New York Times, in addition to hypoxin and trimetazidine, a third heart drug, L-carnitine, was found in Valieva's case. L-carnitine is a much more minor drug, typically, unless it's of a larger amount, and it is found in many other non-doping related situations. But it is interesting if, the hypoxin and the trimetazidine. Now, 2 to 6%, if it was done in training every day, you could imagine how that compounds over time. Now, this is really a situation where they are talking about performance in competition, but they haven't discussed about how a hypoxin would impact an athlete in training time and time again, which is how athletes certainly can get a competitive advantage. Now, there is certainly one has to wonder whether Kamila Valieva will compete at the upcoming World Figure Skating Championships. Now, I want to talk a little bit about hair sampling and the consequences for Russia, because the IOC had Russia on probation at these Olympic Games. They were the Russian Olympic Committee. And you have to think that if this comes back, that Kamila Valieva did indeed test positive for trimetazidine in her B sample, what kind of repercussions should Russia have for an athlete? One of their star athletes tested positive for a heart medication at 15 years old. Should the CAS not come to the conclusion that they are believing this situation, that her grandfather somehow burped in a glass and she had 3 heart medications in her? One has to wonder about whether Russia should be imposed more sanctions on them. It's hard to believe that the IOC will somehow ban Russia from the Olympics, because they have been so unwilling to for the last several Olympic Games. But I have to wonder about this situation. Could the IOC actually require Russia to foot a much larger bill for doping? And also, perhaps, I think that we could have a situation where perhaps Russian athletes would have to be subject to stricter drug testing. I would certainly recommend that figure skaters, all Olympic athletes from Russia, be tested more often, and that they all be required to use the biological passport, perhaps hair sampling included. I think that could be something that they have earned through repeated state-sponsored doping and having to use. It's very interesting. If you look at the WADA budget, Russia actually only pays as much as countries Italy, Germany, and France. Countries seem to pay a proportionate amount. The US pays 2.5 times what Russia actually does. Canada also pays more than Russia. Interesting, because WADA is funded as a 50-50 split. 50% of the money comes from the IOC, which is majority of television rights, and 50% from the individual governments. And it's a trickle-down effect, from WADA to the other organizations. So very interesting when you look at the fact that Russia, who has had a state-sponsored doping program and been banned, or at least punished for the last several Olympics, they still are not paying as much as other countries. And why is that? And should that be the case? Should Russia be forced to pay, a disproportionate amount of money to WADA? Thinking that sports have been incredibly important to Vladimir Putin, you have to wonder if it would be of the utmost importance for him to just fork over the money to maintain Russian status in those Olympics. I also would not recommend RUSADA being able to do the testing. Now, if you read Rodchenkov's book or The Russian Affair, they talk about how RUSADA would actually allow athletes to have appointments to come in far in advance, and they would be told when they needed to test clean. So these athletes who are purportedly testing clean for out-of-competition testing would be known potentially months in advance that on November 1st, you need to be testing clean and come to our office and give us a pee sample. They would also tell them to have samples in their freezer. Now let's think about this. If RUSADA is alerting athletes to when they are going to be tested, it makes the entire notion of out-of-competition testing to be a joke. in the US, in Canada, and other countries, athletes have to let them know where they're going to be at any moment. Otherwise, they get a strike. After so many strikes, a sanction is imposed on an athlete. That is how the the drug testers are always, out to find them. They have to know when they're at the gym, when they're going to the masseuse, when they are going to the restaurant. Basically, they have to actually supply them with their daily schedule in advance. Very interesting, because if you think about it, Maria Sotskova, who tested positive for furosemide, also you have to remember about Karolina Kostner. Remember, Karolina Kostner was suspended not because she doped herself, but because she aided her boyfriend in evading a drug test. Now, she was held out of competition for several years. How come Ekaterina Bobrova, who actually had meldonium in her system, had a far lesser sentence, which the ISU, overturned and basically allowed her to compete again the next season? She was not allowed to compete at the 2016 World Figure Skating Championships, but she was then allowed back into sport. But Karolina Kostner had to sit out for several years because she helped her boyfriend. Now, who should really have the longer sentence there? And was the fact that Bobrova was Russian and from a larger federation something that played into that? It certainly does make you wonder in that situation. Another note of interest came from a Washington Post article during the Olympic Games. And I wanted to quote part of this. This is from February 14th about eteri tutberidze. It says, while there has been no direct evidence that tutberidze was involved in Valieva's positive test, to those familiar with Russian tactics, it's unlikely any violation could have happened without the involvement of her coach and potentially more powerful figures. David Tinsley, a former Drug Enforcement Administration agent and the CEO of Five Stones Intelligence, the company previously hired by WADA to investigate Russia's state-sponsored doping, said Russia's Olympic coaches are often directly controlled by the country's security and intelligence apparatuses. In Russian doping cases, it's often the athlete, but even more so, particularly when the athlete is a child, there's that figure in the shadows who's working with the coach. They've got dossiers on every one of the coaches, Tinsley said of the Russian intelligence agencies, such as the Federal Security Service. The whole context of it is, don't screw this up for the state. Now, the U.S. wants to grant residence permits to doping whistleblowers in Russia. The law was introduced by Congressman Steve Cohen, and this idea was approved by the American anti-doping agency USADA. It is our responsibility to help courageous people who are willing to risk their well-being to protect clean sport, athletes' rights, and fair play, said USADA President Travis Tigert. Now, we also have to look at rules that are changing to the ISU. Remember, the ISU is currently about to meet in June for the upcoming elections. Now, it is believed that Helena Gordon-Poltarek wants to be ISU president. She is a Polish official. She is on the technical committee for ice dance, and she is believed to be very favorable to the Russians if you read certain skatingscores.com information. Now, very interesting that she would want to. That would be perhaps a shadow figure for Russia in there, although there hasn't been a figure skating president of the International Skating Union, which of course has much bigger questions about whether or not why should speed skating and figure skating be together. That has been an age-old question. Now, it's very interesting when we talk about the ties between figure skating, Olympic sports, and the government, because remember, it is actually believed that the Kremlin has to sign off on all teams that are named for the Olympic Games and the World Championships. Interesting to note that Maria Kuptseva-Shashina, agent of figure skating coach eteri tutberidze, answered a question about the risks for the tutberidze brand after the doping scandal surrounding Kamila Valieva. Brands very often use a reputation risk clause in advertising contracts, which gives them the right to terminate the agreement. But companies carefully consider each specific situation and its impact on brand image. International companies are much stricter about reputational risks. They have a clear set of rules by which they terminate contracts instantly and without talking. If I'm not mistaken, when Maria Sharapova announced her positive doping test, one of her advertisers contacted her within 10 minutes after the press conference and notified her of the termination of the contract. Eteri Tutberidze is a brand herself, and this is an exception to the rule. companies pay attention not only to medals, but primarily to the media image and recognition. Tutberidze has become a symbol of women's figure skating in the world. She has her own audience, different from the audience of athletes, Kuptseva said. Mikhail Gorobuntsov, a representative of Tinkoff Bank, said that the bank plans to continue cooperation with Tutberidze as he is confident in the positive outcome of the proceedings in the Valieva case. Well, Valieva has become quite the symbol in Russia. She has had 20 to 30 meter posters of her in Moscow. It is perhaps believed that this figure skater is actually set for life. One of the main topics at the ISU Congress is whether or not they will raise the age limit. This is something that Sandra Bezic argued is really window dressing on a bigger cultural problem inside figure skating, although it seems to be fait accompli that this is something that will be passed. It's believed that it will go up to perhaps 17 years of age. Of course, Anna Shcherbakova, who won the Olympics, is 17. So would this really protect much? It seems unclear in figure skating, especially if athletes at the junior level are performing quadruple jumps. And if the CAS's ruling in Valieva's case is confirmed, it would seem that a protected athlete would potentially be allowed to take performance-enhancing drugs based on those rulings. So if an athlete could take as many drugs as they wanted to, competing at the Junior World Figure Skating Championships, and then turn 17 and turn senior, is it really protecting much? Or is it just meant to look like it's protecting much? In the case of the International Skating Union and the International Olympic Committee, one really has to wonder about that. I did want to talk a little bit about the future of the sport as we look out at the next couple of months, because the Russian invasion is impacting whether or not athletes from Russia will actually be able to fly, as many countries are actually banning flights to and from Russia. So you have to wonder about whether or not there could be flights and whether or not the Russian athletes will be allowed to compete. One of the things that has been argued by many sports figures is that because sports are so important to Putin, that they believe that Russian athletes should actually be banned from participating in sporting events. Now, the IOC had urged events not to be scheduled in Russia or Belarus, and had urged organizations that had having events there to actually reschedule them elsewhere. And I'll read that. The Executive Board of the International Olympic Committee has called on international federations to reschedule or cancel competitions scheduled in Russia or Belarus. Belarus is mentioned because Russian troops were allowed to go into Belarus, which is believed to be an arm of Russia. The IOC Executive Board today confirmed the strong condemnation of the violation of the Olympic truce by the Russian government and the government of Belarus that supported it. The relevant UN resolution was adopted by the UN General Assembly on December 2nd, 2021, by consensus of all 193 UN member states. The Olympic truce began 7 days before the start of the Olympic Games on February 4th, 2022, and ends 7 days after the closing of the Paralympic Games. The IOC Executive Board is today calling on all international sports federations to reschedule or cancel their sporting events currently scheduled in Russia or Belarus. They must take into account the violation of the Olympic truce by the governments of Russia and Belarus and give absolute attention to the safety of athletes. The IOC itself does not plan any events either in Russia or in Belarus, the IOC said. Earlier, Russian President Vladimir Putin decided to conduct a special operation after the request of the DPR and LPR. Now, it's also, many people are bringing up that the truce was also violated in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. Now, as we look ahead, one also has to talk about the impact on athletes. So not only are they talking about events, whether or not they should be allowed to be held in Russia or in Belarus, Poland and Sweden refused to play Russia in the FIFA World Cup qualifier due to the Ukrainian invasion. Eurovision, the singing competition, is actually not allowing any Russian participants. And Norway and Denmark call for a ban on Russia and Belarus at Olympic sporting events. The Norwegian Olympic and Paralympic Committee and Confederation of Sports, NIF, and National Olympic Committee and Sports Confederation of Denmark, DIF, have called for all athletes representing Russia and Belarus to be banned from international sports events in light of the invasion of Ukraine. Following an extraordinary meeting of the NIF Sports Board, the organization condemned Russia's actions in Ukraine as a clear violation of international law and described the war as totally unacceptable. The NIF backed international condemnation and sanctions in response to Russia's military action and has called for Russian and Belarusian athletes to be prevented from participating in international sports events outside of the two countries. It also suggested Russian and Belarusian officials should be suspended from any positions held internationally and said it would encourage international federations and major sports bodies, including the International Olympic Committee and International Paralympic Committee, to follow its stance. Norwegian sports will aggressively support further internationally coordinated sanctions against Russia and Russian and Belarusian sports in the future. The NIF concluded the DIF echoed sentiments from its Norwegian equivalent. Russia's military of Ukraine is affecting us all deeply, the president commented. These are frightening images and reports that come from the escalating acts of war hour by hour. Now, this is obviously terrible news. The ISU has not said that it supports banning Russian or Belarusian athletes, but this is something that, should the International Olympic Committee decide to act, would obviously impact figure skating. Perhaps public pressure could also change in these directions. One also has to wonder if the World Championships would even be held in France should further instability continue to impact the region. It's important to note that many Ukrainian skaters and Ukrainian skaters who live abroad have family in Ukraine. Anastasia Shibotova had given a quote several days ago that they were trying to leave Kiev. Viktor Petrenko is currently located in Kiev and was in a bomb shelter the other evening. So there are certainly many athletes who are trying to get out of Ukraine. For many, there is simply nowhere to go. Also, adult males aged 18 to 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine, and they are to be conscripted into the army. There are obviously several male figure skaters above the age of 18 who would not be able to leave the country to even participate in the World Figure Skating Championships. Obviously, the World Figure Skating Championships seem completely trivial in light of current events. Two-time Olympic champion in figure skating Tatiana Voloshajar spoke about the situation between Russia and Ukraine. I don't know what to write. It's hard. Many of my relatives are there. Dad, sisters with families, grandmother. We try to keep in touch, but it doesn't always work out. And when there is no news for several hours and you know that they are going somewhere trying to be safe, it is scary, very. But we all, the whole family, try to hold on and keep calm. How can we? War is the most terrible thing that can be. That this is happening in 2022 is unthinkable. But it's even more painful to see and read online quarrels between ordinary people, Ukrainians and Russians. I'm sure that no one in their right mind thinks that war is good, and all the people around me, regardless of citizenship, are horrified by what is happening. We are all now hostages of circumstances, and we just wait and pray that everything ends as soon as possible. Please take care of each other, do not quarrel, support each other. It's not easy for everyone right now. In this situation, there is only one truth. Peace is good, war is bad, wrote Voloshajar. She is obviously Ukrainian and represented Russia at the 2014 Olympic Games. We'll continue to be following this story. Thank you. Good night.